Hey guys, here's another research video. This one is about how to incorporate information into your research paper. So how to appropriately quote, summarize, and paraphrase. So for any of this to make sense, first we need to talk about what attribution is. Attribution really is just about giving credit to a source of information. And if you're doing your research paper correctly, there should be lots of attribution, particularly in the body of your paper. It is true that we don't really have to attribute generally agreed upon facts, like stuff that'll come up when you start typing into Google and it doesn't take you to a site, it just gives you that information instantly. That information is usually agreed upon facts. Like George Washington was the first president, helium's atomic number is 2, stuff like that. But when you're in doubt and unsure whether or not you should attribute something, just attribute it. If you give credit to something you didn't need to give credit to, the penalty for that is minimal. But if you fail to give credit when you should have, you are plagiarizing. And so you might be plagiarizing with a good conscience, but you're still doing it. So when in doubt, attribute. Okay, so one way of including information in your research paper is through direct quotes. So of course they've got to be word for word identical to the information that you got in your sources. And of course you have to attribute them to your sources. You have to give credit for those because those quotes didn't come from you, they came from another source. You want to be extremely selective in using quoted material in your text. If you have more than 5 quotes in your research paper, that's probably a good sign that you've over-relied on quotes. Quotes should be brief, they shouldn't be longer than 3 lines probably, and they should be for information that you absolutely must have word for word. So let's talk about that. So let's just go through a hypothetical, and let's say by some miracle you're walking through Creighton Prep and Rihanna happens to be there, and you're there with your best buddy, and your best buddy decides, man, when am I going to get this opportunity to ask out Rihanna again? I'm going for it. And so you watch your friend ask out Rihanna, and she replies to him. In one version of the story, Rihanna says to your friend who asks her out, no thanks. In another version of the story, Rihanna says to your friend who asks her out, I wouldn't go out with you if the world were flooded with raw sewage and you were the only guy on the planet with a treehouse. Now, in those 2 stories, one of them is important to quote. That would be the second one because it's vivid. No thanks certainly communicates a message, but there's no need to put that as waste a quote on no thanks. But when Rihanna tells your buddy that she wouldn't go out with him no matter what the circumstances are, you want to get that word for word. So be very selective when you're choosing quotes in your research paper. Don't waste them. All right, so another way of incorporating material into your research paper is through summarizing. So summarizing means you take a lot of information and you put only the main ideas of that information into your own words. So you might take a few pages of material and express it in just a few sentences. Even when you're doing that, you still have to attribute your sources because that's information that didn't come from you. It came from another source. And the last mode of incorporating research into your paper is through paraphrasing. This is going to be the bread and butter of the kind of attribution and research you incorporate into your paper. So paraphrasing is like summarizing, but instead of taking a very, very broad view of source material, it takes a very specific view. It takes a passage and puts it into your own words. Of course, you have to attribute. You have to say where this information came from. And when you paraphrase, what you have is usually shorter than the original passage, but it's got a specific focus. So most of your material ought to be paraphrased. It's better than quoting, something like no thanks. It's an undistinguished passage, and it keeps you from quoting too much, relying on quotes to be filler in your paper. That makes a paper very weak when that happens. And it also helps you understand the meaning of your sources. When you're paraphrasing things, you are interpreting that information. You're understanding it and you're interpreting it. So let's see how this works. So here I've included a passage from a book, and it goes on for 3 sentences. And let's say this was some original source material I wanted to use for a research project. So what we have here is a paraphrase of that longer passage. I've reduced it down to 2 sentences. In research papers, students often quote excessively. Since the problem usually originates during note-taking, it is essential to minimize the material recorded verbatim. So I said in 2 sentences what the previous passage had said in several sentences. So it's taking a specific idea and putting it in my own words in a shorter passage. Okay, so what we have here is a summary. It's even shorter than the paraphrase. It focuses on the bigger picture in fewer words. Students should keep direct quoting to a minimum when taking notes. That's a quick summary. And finally, what we have here is plagiarism. It's already plagiarism right off the bat because we have no attribution of this material. I didn't include the source's name or any information about the source anywhere. I represented these ideas as if they were my own. But let's take a look at it even more closely. Here I've got the original passage next to the plagiarized passage. So aside from the lack of attribution, if we take a look sentence by sentence, we don't necessarily have the exact same words, but we have an overlap of about 80% of the same words, the same structure of the sentences, and we're not paraphrasing. We're not putting much of this at all into our own words. We're not really reducing the length of the passage substantially. We're going pretty directly and lifting the ideas from one source into another source. So that's the thing we've got to avoid. If we plagiarize on the research paper, if it's an accidental plagiarism that's done, with a good conscience, you won't be written up for plagiarizing, but you will be required to redo the paper, which would be a stone cold bummer. We've been working on this paper for so long, and it'll feel so good to be finished with it. So avoid plagiarizing so you can avoid redoing this thing and redoing it for a worse grade. Here are the big takeaways as you compose your first draft. First of all, I said it before, bears repeating though, it is way better to cite your sources too often than not often enough. If you cite your sources too frequently on the first draft, I'll just tell you where to drop some citations, but the penalty won't be tremendous. If you give too much credit, you're never going to be in as much trouble as you'll be in for not giving enough credit. If you don't cite your sources frequently enough, you have, in effect, plagiarized your paper. And the best case scenario is you'll have to redo your paper or parts of your paper for a reduced grade. Worst case scenario, I'll have to write you up for plagiarizing. So I know nobody wants to be in that boat. You can avoid it by citing your sources frequently. Whenever in doubt, cite the source. The other big takeaway, paraphrasing should be the technique you use most often when you present information in your research paper. Avoid over-relying on quotes. Don't quote more than 5 times in the paper, if you even quote that many times. Paraphrasing is what you need to do. And finally, make sure your citation uses the first element of the information on your works cited page. And I've made another terrible video that walks you through how to cite sources in the text of your paper. So you can watch that one too, you lucky guys. So guys, good luck working on the paper. You've been working really hard and we're coming to the finish line. We're going to get there.